nice to be back on home turf again. Pretty much sort of homecoming gig for me. So I was very delighted to accept the invitation to talk in a forum that I've been sort of, as Kevin said, sort of, in the past sort of organising outside speakers. And to talk a bit about the research project that I've been involved with since actually 2015, since the Mediterranean migration crisis in its current form exploded. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the context, which some of you may be familiar with, others of you perhaps less so. And just to get some idea of the scale of the exodus into Mediterranean Europe in the period between 2014 and 2017 by sea. So these are people coming not through any regular means of transport by air or by ferry, but by extremely dangerous, overcrowded either fishing boats or rubber dinghies. And what you see is the kind of the scale of the, even in 2014, 170,000 coming to Italy, a much smaller number coming into Greece, and this is predominantly coming from the coast of Libya into Italy. We get to 2015, and then, of course, the situation massively blows up. It explodes, with Greece receiving over 850,000 arrivals by sea. The actual figure for Italy drops. And then we see, again, a change in 2016. That massive peak drops to round about, it's still significant, around about 170,000. Italy again overtakes Greece. Smaller numbers, still significant, coming into Spain. By 2017, you can see the numbers are falling, and substantially falling in Greece, below the level of 2014, whereas in Spain they're starting to pick up and almost catching up with Greece, right? So that's well over 1 million people moving across the most dangerous sea passage in the world. So what's behind those numbers? What's behind those numbers are these countries of origin, predominantly. As you would expect, Syria, those refugees of Syrian origin accounted for fully over half that number. Next, you see Afghanistan. People often forget that there's still a conflict, a very violent conflict going on in Afghanistan. Just because most Western troops have gone, it doesn't mean to say there's not an active and very dangerous civil war going on there, which is still producing large numbers of displaced people. Iraq, again, in many parts of Iraq, there is still a great deal of unrest and danger, which is also producing refugees. And then we have smaller numbers here. This was at the peak year of 2015. Those percentages have gone up subsequently, but you have Somalia, you have Iran, you have Nigeria, Pakistan, Eritrea. Probably now I would say Nigeria is the largest country of origin for those transiting the Mediterranean in search of safe havens in Italy or wherever they can find them. But of course they can't find them because the ports are now closed. So let's put this into a bit of context. Forced displacement is driven by conflict, and more than 2/3, that's 68% of all refugees worldwide come from those 5 countries. So I've already mentioned Syria and Afghanistan. The others that are significant are South Sudan and Myanmar. We do see Sudanese refugees sometimes turning up on the coast of Europe, but most of them are internally displaced and have no means of escaping. And of course, we know about the situation in Myanmar, where the vast majority of that population is now on the border of Bangladesh, and Somalia still accounts for some million refugees and displaced people. Again, a lot of them internally displaced or in neighbouring countries such as Ethiopia and Kenya. Where do they go? Well, you would think from the headlines and from the hysteria that almost all of these refugees are either in Europe or heading for Europe. The reality, of course, is quite different. 3.5 million are to be found in Turkey, just under 1.5 million in Pakistan. Uganda is the next biggest host, roughly the same number, followed by Lebanon. Lebanon, that's about 1 in 4 of their population are refugees, and it's a tiny, tiny country, smaller than Wales. Again, kind of people will be surprised to see Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, hosts about 1 million refugees, and that's actually more than Germany. So you have to kind of go through all of these countries before you get to Germany, and then following Germany is, as I said, Bangladesh, mostly hosting refugees from Burma, Myanmar, and Sudan itself. So this gives you some idea of the scale of the issue and how many, what proportion of those refugees are hosted by developing countries, some of them very, very poor indeed. So in terms of the European picture then, the routes that tend to be used by those who've been forcibly displaced up through Egypt, via Sudan, via the Horn of Africa is one particular route. The Libyan coast is the route which is usually used by migrants transiting from sub-Saharan, West Sub-Saharan Africa, including Central Africa, but also those coming from across a sort of a lateral route. We can't see this on the map, but further down again from places like Eritrea and Somalia, who make that massively long and dangerous journey across the Sahara Desert. And they get to these departure points on the Turkish coast. This was where the vast majority of the refugees disembarked from in 2015. And here along this part of the Libyan coast, with destinations eventually to Italy. But in fact, if we had a sort of a better close-up, you could see that most of these vessels aren't seaworthy enough to make the journey. So they tend to be, once they get outside of Libyan coastal waters, a lot of them will sort of stop and capsize. And so most of the people are taken as rescued shipwrecked passengers from a fairly narrow strip here. Well, that was the case until about a year ago, to various ports around Sicily. Okay. I should probably say at this point, any questions? Because I know there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot to take in, but I wanted to provide a bit of the context. And so our work, our research team that was, I should say, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council to survey and to document this mass exodus took place in Sicily, in Lampedusa, in Palermo, Catania, different parts of Sicily, as well as Rome, but also in Lesbos and Athens in Greece, with some follow-up work in Germany, which I'll come to. So what I want to do, though, in what remains of this lecture is to actually talk about the experience of the new arrivals when they get to Europe. And this is really a story, as much as anything, about how a kind of humanitarian disaster turned into an inhumanitarian response on the part of Fortress Europe. You know, the sort of welcome that these desperate people fleeing the appalling conflict in Syria, fleeing appalling civil wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, should have experienced was for the most part not provided. And instead, they met an often very hostile response by the national authorities. The response of the EU to the mass migration of 2015 was to set up a number of reception centres, and probably better referred to actually as detention centres, in Italy and Greece, which they refer to as hotspots, with the intention of fingerprinting and digitally documenting every single asylum seeker, with the sole purpose of ensuring that if they transited across the borders of Italy and Greece into other EU member states, they could be identified and potentially sent back to Italy and Greece under the so-called Dublin protocols, a series of treaties which had been signed by EU member states with the sole purpose of preventing asylum seekers from moving from one member state to another and claiming asylum not in the first country they arrived at, but in a subsequent country. And there's lots more to say about that. I will say a bit more about it, but this turned out to be a very contentious policy, and one in which Italy and Greece found themselves kind of increasingly unhappy to enforce a policy which meant that they ended up having to take the vast majority of asylum seekers. And it's partly why, because of this, also Germany decided that it was going to open its borders and to waive the sort of privilege it had under the Dublin regulation to send people back. So we also saw lots of fortified border zones and crossing points, fences and police dogs and tear gas were used across the border with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia in northern Greece here to prevent the migrants from travelling outside of Greece. And at the same time, the islands on which the refugees had arrived effectively became kind of open prisons, because the Greek government forbade newly arrived asylum seekers from, after a certain point, this was in the spring of 2016, from moving out of the islands to mainland Greece. So they became effectively holding zones, and they were kept in extremely overcrowded, insanitary and dangerous camps where 3, 4, 5 times the population that they were meant for, and it's still the case today, are forced to live in absolute conditions of absolute squalor. So the consequence of this deliberate state policy of effectively preventing the movement of migrants and containing and controlling where they could live or simply exist was to create a series of extremely marginal spaces across Europe. Bridges, railway stations, abandoned buildings, and in northern France, in Calais in particular, the area around Calais, because of the destruction of the so-called jungle and temporary accommodation provided by NGOs, they were literally forced to sleep in ditches and sand dunes. This is a quote from the Oxford Refugee Studies Centre, and I think it's an important observation here, which is, you know, one of the things that people who are fleeing their homes to find safety the first thing they really want to do psychologically, once you've left the home that's been bombed or burned or is just literally unsafe, is to find somewhere safe and stable where you can just, be with your family, to find some peace and quiet, somewhere where you're not going to be constantly harassed and forced to kind of rapidly react to danger. And of course, this is precisely what these refugees were denied when they arrived in Europe. So in other words, it's a kind of a double abjection, a double violence that they faced. But having to be resourceful, there was an interesting kind of, range of different ways in which we found that refugees were able to kind of make do or find somewhere of kind of finding some shelter. They used abandoned buildings. They used, some would stay on the floors of friends and relatives. Don't forget, a lot of people had existing relatives in Europe before they themselves fled. They built shelters of their own. Of course, many brought tents with them and slept outdoors. This is an example, actually, of a fairly rare example of a constructed temporary camp. These are sort of plastic units provided by UNHCR. Other camps have used shipping containers, and even IKEA has sort of designed, prefabricated shelters. But these are rather untypical. Mostly, refugees are simply forced to kind of find anywhere they can, and usually, like homeless here in this country, are using kind of tents as their only shelter, which, as you can imagine, in the winter, and people think that Greece and the Greek islands are always lovely and warm all year round. That's not the case. Lesbos gets heavy snow in the winter, and small babies and elderly people have died because they've been forced to sleep outside in this appalling weather. So, so I said I was going to talk a bit about the hotspots, and there's been a sort of expanding number of these, all sort of targeted at the ports where the majority of asylum seekers disembark in Sicily and in the Greek islands, as well as Athens, Thessaloniki, Alexandropoli, and Corinth. And so the European Asylum Support Office, or EASO, it's an interesting agency because it's basically funded by the European Union, but it draws its officials from police forces, border officials, etc., experts in identification and digital identification from all over Europe. And they work alongside the police and immigration officials in Greece and Italy. But increasingly, it's the EASO officials who are actually doing the asylum processing. So this is an interesting question, particularly for those of you who are doing kind of politics-related topics on the EU. This is probably a very rare example, if you like, of the European Union acting as a state in its own right, doing the police work, and often with local officials, as it were, simply kind of sitting and watching or providing data support or whatever. This is one of the most notorious of the hotspots. This is a reception centre that formed part of the film that I made for the project, the documentary film I made for the project. And these are a couple of the stills from the film. You may recognise the back of the head of the actual Greek Prime Minister here, Alex Tsipras, and the Martin Schulz, the back of the head of Martin Schulz here, the former President of the European Parliament, failed challenger to Angela Merkel in the last German elections. So here they are looking at this plan for the refugee reception camp in Moria on Lesbos, which even then was 2.5 times over capacity. And this was a sort of an improvised sign which the authorities had put up, which gives you an idea. The intention was really to sort people by nationality into separate parts of the camp. So the Syrians actually had their own separate camp down the road, a much better camp, I should say. And those who were from other parts of other conflict zones, if you like, who were not necessarily going to get fast-tracked as refugees, were kept in this former army barracks. But it's a sort of a good visual example, I think, of how the European Union, in its very kind of conception of how it deals with forced migrants and asylum seekers, has in mind the idea of nationality as a way of sorting on the basis of legitimate asylum claims, even though it's a complete breach, absolutely forbidden under the 1951 Refugee Convention, absolutely forbidden in terms of European asylum law itself. So there's what the law says, and there's what happens on the ground. And what happens on the ground is that basically people get sorted according to their nationality. And those who are sort of, particularly if you're from Pakistan, the unfortunate people from Pakistan weren't even allowed inside this dreadful camp. They were forced into this area called the Olive Groves without any sanitation whatsoever, without any sort of protection. They just had whatever tents and stuff they had brought with them or got donated by volunteers. So there's a real hierarchy, a real very clear pecking order, if you like, in terms of your status, in terms of your country of origin, pretty much determined how you were going to get treated, whether you were ever going to get off the islands, if you had any chance of moving to other destinations in Europe, and so on. Okay. And this is a Lampedusa, an extraordinarily beautiful place. I mean, I do encourage you to, I feel like almost duty-bound to sort of champion Lampedusan tourism, because the population there have had such a tough time of it for not just the last few years, but for a good few decades. And they've hosted an extraordinarily large number of refugees who've come through there on their way to mainland Europe. Lampedusa is also home to one of the first hotspots at the other end of the island, which has, again, sort of grown and expanded, and is mostly full of Eritrean nationals. And this is a protest by mostly Eritreans. And you need to know something a bit about Eritrea as well, which is it's probably no exaggeration to say that Eritrea is really not a country you would want to be a young person, certainly not a young man in, unless you had very powerful connections, because they have compulsory conscription into the military, and the military basically uses its conscripts as a slave army, effectively. Torture, abduction, arbitrary execution are widespread, and this is massively well documented by all the major human rights organizations. There's not usually any trouble. People have very little trouble on the whole, apart from the UK, in demonstrating that they are at risk of persecution if they return to Eritrea. It's also a country which is, on the whole, its religion on the whole, interestingly enough, is Catholic. So this is the main Catholic church on the island, and the local priest has kind of been something of a local hero in sort of speaking up for and on behalf of the those who are sort of forcibly detained on the island. Now the issue here, what they're complaining about, is that they've had their fingerprints forcibly taken. They're not supposed to forcibly take your fingerprints, but they do. And so, as I said before, under the Dublin rules, this means that they don't have any chance of going to where most people want to go, which is where often their family members are, to the north of Europe, particularly to Sweden, where there's quite a large Eritrean population, but also Germany and so on. So if you get fingerprinted, the chances are that you will be refused entry to those countries. Family reunion is an extremely complicated and difficult process. Even if you're successful, it can take several years. So they know the consequences of this biopolitics of digital identification means misery for them and their families. And that's why they were protesting so vehemently. And this is the former Calais Jungle, which I'm sure you've seen on the news and so on and so forth. But it gives you some sense of the extent to which this informal camp was pitched up right against this massive fence, which the British authorities, the British government, have given several million euros to the French government in order to construct this massive fence along the main autoroute into Calais port and alongside the Eurostar rail line. But actually, although it's now been destroyed, bulldozed, and so on and so forth, there's some really interesting stuff that's been going on, was at the time and subsequently, to try and sort of document this informal kind of tent city, really. So volunteers kind of did a census, and they found that at its peak that it was a population of over 5,000, so a relatively sizable town with a whole range of nationalities: Afghan from Pakistan, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kurds from different parts of Iran, Iraq, Turkey. It had its own places of worship. There were mosques and churches, a women and children's centre. There were bakeries, restaurants, and so on. And there's some really interesting documentation. This is from a website by an architect called Shahid Salem. But there's some very interesting kind of documentation of how these improvised buildings were really a vital part of the community and helped these people kind of establish some sense of place, even in the midst of turmoil and despite frequent attacks by the French police, which remains a constant danger for any undocumented migrant, not just in Nord-Pas de Calais, but anywhere they are in France at the moment. So this is Berlin. This is the former airport of Tempelhof. So anyone who knows their Cold War history will be familiar with this, where the Berlin airlift was conducted successfully, as it were, kind of like the West sort of managed to sort of lift the siege on Berlin by flying in supplies sort of every few minutes into this tiny little airport right in the center of the city. Now it has been turned into temporary accommodation for mostly single men from those countries that we saw in Moria, the countries that won't get automatic refugee status, i.e. non-Syrians, people from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, etc., etc. So these people can only apply for subsidiary protection. In other words, they won't necessarily find that they will get refugee status, but it may be that they can show that they are still at risk of harm if they're returned to their country of origin. But it's very much a second-class status, particularly in Germany. There's no guarantee of anything other than very temporary hostel accommodation. There's no right to work, no right to training and education, etc., etc. And in my view, not just in my view, but the view of many NGOs and activists, this is quite a dangerous policy, because what it does is it sort of marginalizes and it excludes a demographic, young isolated men who can't reconnect with their families, becoming increasingly angry and frustrated, and quite obviously are a target for radicalization. So the lack of integration of this particular population, one could argue, is extremely counterproductive if what you're trying to do is create conditions in Germany where the new arrivals can, as it were, assimilate into German life and not feel resentful and not feel that they should be invested, as it were, in some of these more radical groups who are seeking to foment violence and conflict. But I don't want to give the impression that the picture is a kind of a universally bleak one. There are also what I call a number of spaces of hope, to quote David Harvey, or spaces of solidarity as well, across the Mediterranean and across Europe. And it's important, I think, to recognize that in the midst of all this human suffering and this great disruption, in the midst of often very tough and uncompromising and inhumane policies by national governments, by the European Union and its agents, both at sea and at the border, local authorities, some of them, and particularly local non-governmental organizations and solidarity organizations have been doing amazing, unsung and often unreported work in trying to make the lives of these desperate people a little easier. And these are some of the kind of more significant examples of this that I talk about in our research. Riace, which is a little town in Calabria, Picpa, which is a volunteer-run reception centre, mostly for vulnerable women and children. In Lesvos, there's a place called City Plaza in Athens, which is run by volunteers, but is co-run also by the refugees themselves. There is the mayor of Palermo and the city council that have actively resisted the new security law which the Interior Minister Matteo Salvini has introduced, which is trying to prevent asylum seekers from accessing services or having any kind of civic documentation, so they can't send their kids to school or rent houses, etc. He has refused to do that and has decided that, if necessary, he personally will register them. So this is a kind of a very significant level of grassroots revolt almost against this policy of what I call a policy of suspended lives against the new migrant arrivals. And there are also some very positive integration stories from Germany, the so-called Kaiserslautern model, which provides rapid integration into the normal housing system for refugees. And Calais as well, after the demolition of the jungle, nevertheless, fantastic solidarity efforts, not just by British volunteers, but by volunteers all over Europe, which have been involved in sort of trying to bring particularly unaccompanied young people to their families, either in the UK or different other parts of Europe. And so these are all quite positive, I think, counterexamples. I haven't got a lot of time left, so I'll just sort of probably just rapidly go through some of these examples. Now, the guy at the top of this slide is actually now the former mayor, we should say, of Riace, because he has been removed from his position by the prefect on the instruction of the Minister of the Interior. Why? Well, they say because he's been guilty of facilitating illicit immigration and various other financial irregularities. That was actually thrown out by the court, and of course the real reason is this: Riace provides the threat of a good example. So we've got an interior minister who now is exploiting racism and xenophobia as the leader of the Northern League and wants to encourage cities around Italy to be extremely, how can I put it, sort of create, what's the word, hostile environment, I think is the word, hostile environment for all refugees. But a number of mayors following Lucano's example have said that they won't do that, that they will sort of follow his example. It's a long story, but he basically created, out of his dying town, a kind of a sanctuary for a group of refugees back at the end of the 1990s who got shipwrecked on the coast just by his little town. And they took them in. It's like a kind of almost like a sort of biblical Hollywood story, really. And they housed them, they fed them. Many of them stayed, and he then said, "Look, okay, we have discovered our purpose and our function as a town. This town was dying, and now it's thriving again." And he therefore said, "Look, we will turn this little village into a reception centre. If the government agrees to fund us, we will provide decent accommodation from the empty houses. We will help people learn Italian." But it was interesting because in return, the new arrivals would sort of help do up the properties. They would sort of provide elderly care. They provided babysitting services. Some of them, of course, had skills as car mechanics, barbers, etc., etc. It's an amazing example of what can happen if people decide to cooperate and show some love to one another. But this was too appalling a prospect for Salvini, and he, as I said, in 2018 decided to shut down not just the local authority but the whole town, and all of the asylum seekers were forced to leave. They were all expelled from their homes. And this is Pikba, which we spent quite a lot of time. It's a beautiful place under these trees near the airport in Moria, Mytilene, which is the main town in Lesbos. It's really a sort of a sanctuary, so different from the hotspot, from the EU detention centre. Many volunteers come from around the world to sort of stay there and work there and support the work of the community against all odds, despite the regional government trying to shut them down as well on trumped up hygiene charges, etc., etc. Pikba has survived and grown, and I think the director has won some kind of European Peace Prize. An amazing person, and it's an important example again of what solidarity can do to help people who are incredibly traumatized. They tend to have, as I say, they tend to host those who've been shipwrecked or have lost family members as a result of their migrant journey. They've either died along the way or have suffered injury or have come with some pre-existing health condition or disability. So they're among the very most vulnerable. And this is the city plaza. It's actually a squat, technically speaking, but in Athens it's quite interesting. The Athens government is fairly, and even the Greek government, one thing you can sort of credit the Greek Prime Minister is that he's been quite tolerant of the existence of these kind of informal solidarity spaces. And this is one of the biggest. It's a former hotel, now hosts around 400 refugees, including 180 children. People come from all over the world to sort of support and volunteer. But it's really interesting because its philosophy is really based around the idea that there's no hierarchies. The initiative is essentially a sort of anarchist one. Many of the activists in Athens and other parts of Greece working with asylum seekers are anarchists, but kind of Greek anarchists are a bit particular. They're very organised anarchists, if that makes sense, and they're very practical. So they provide clinics, they provide things like creches, they provide schools, they provide Greek lessons, music classes, dance classes. It's a really impressive thing that they've got going there, and they're very, very insistent that refugees themselves should have as much, they should basically decide how the space is used. It's very different from the kind of top-down delivery of aid which you see in other parts of Europe and around the world in terms of refugees. Here's a nice note, which basically says that, I think more eloquently than I've just done. City Plaza is a self-organised squat, does not belong to the state or to the NGO, and it's translated there into Arabic and Farsi. And this is, so I made a documentary, a small film actually, with in 2 parts. It's available on the internet if you want to see it. With the mayor of Palermo, Leoluca Orlando, and in that interview he basically described what's happening in the Mediterranean as orchestrated genocide, and he directly pointed the finger at the European Union for its refusal to provide safe passage for those fleeing persecution, comparing it to mass homicide. So he's a very outspoken guy, having taken on the Sicilian mafia and largely succeeded in pushing them out of their strongholds. This guy's fairly fearless, as you can imagine. Okay. One of the other things that's very interesting and important about Palermo is, as a city, they have passed this charter, which is one of the first in Europe, which basically gives undocumented people, anyone arriving from any part of the world, equal status. And they can participate. They have a thing called the Council of Cultures, over 100 different nationalities and languages, and they have full input into the direction of the council's business. So it's a kind of rare experiment, almost a kind of Babylonian cosmopolitan democracy, really. Of course, there are problems. I'm not saying there aren't. The lots of opposition within the Sicilian native population, as you can imagine. But for all that, it's an encouraging example, I think, of how it's possible to think of the city in a different way, as a space which is genuinely open. Palermo is described by Orlando not as a European city, but an Arab Norman city. He sort of insists that it's really a space which is a mongrel space, half created by the Normans who occupied and invaded it back in the 11th century, and centuries of Arab occupation as well, which is kind of a very unusual way of thinking about things compared to some of our politicians, you could say. And this is a centre which is supported by the local council, part funded by them, the Centro Astali, and this is an interview that we did with one of the residents, and she was kind of talking about the fact that not unusually her refugee journey took in Greece, took in a prior visit to Italy, and eventually she finds her way to Sicily and to Palermo, and ends up sort of getting the kind of help that had been lacking previously, and is now training, has now found a job. She has a house to bring up her children, and I really like the quote that sort of at the end, sort of many people are trying to find somewhere to live. They help me. The Astali Centre is like a family, and many of the volunteers that we spoke to in Greece and Italy sort of echoed this sentiment that they were they saw the people that they were working with very much as members of their own family, rather than just strangers that they were helping in this kind of paternalistic way. So I'm going to probably just wind up really quickly. This is just an example of what's going on in Kaiserslautern. This is a more top-down thing, but it is basically an example of how dilapidated, hard-to-let property in a very run-down part of Germany can be revived, can have, again, the opportunity of a more vibrant population, but you have to also spend the money on other marginal communities in order to win local consensus. So just to conclude then, what we saw is this example in Europe of a hostile environment which was explicitly aimed at deterring and repelling new arrivals, much as we've seen at the level of member states, particularly the UK. But at the same time, undermining that, we've seen municipality-led solutions which are more solidaristic and, importantly, grassroots, pretty much informal urban solidarity networks, which are creating spaces of hope and solidarity, which again are not often understood, not often well reported, but are very important for those who receive that help and support. And future implications, I'll just leave that there. I think we just need to be aware of the fact that if we're creating these spaces of objection, if we're sort of saying it's normal to have people sleeping under bridges and railway stations and in sand dunes, and these include children who have been abused and beaten and exploited, if we tolerate that, I think, is it a Manic Street Preachers song? Basically I think they say if you tolerate that, then your kids will be next. And I think that's the kind of fitting thing to end on, because if they can get away with it in terms of foreign people with dark-coloured skins, well, we've seen the kind of implications of a very hostile approach to social welfare in this country. It's an easy leap to apply that sort of extremely sort of exclusionary form of inhumane politics to members of our own community, if you want to use that expression. So I'll leave it there.